This is Criteria. All right, welcome back, everyone. I'm James Majewski. This is Criteria, and I'm here with my co-host Thomas V. Miras.
Hello.
And we're talking about The Mission. We've got a guest with us today. Thomas, you want to introduce our guest?
Yeah, our guest today to discuss this classic film beloved by many Catholics is Gerald Russello. He's the editor of the University Bookman. He's the author of a book about Russell Kirk and the editor of 2 books by Christopher Dawson. And Gerald, you are, let me just not talk to you before introducing you. Welcome to the show, Gerald.
Hi, thanks. I'm honored to be invited. Thanks to both of you.
Gerald, you're talking to us from not too far from we are, actually, right? You said you're near the Bronx?
Yes, very, very low Westchester. My wife and I are both New York natives, New York City natives. And when we needed to move because of the number of our children, we could not bring ourselves to go too far. So we're less than a mile from the city border.
This sort of came about because we've been following each other on Twitter for a while. And it's funny because I've observed that you and I are like 2 of the only people who tweets like personal tweets and personal opinions under an organizational like Twitter handle, which is really funny. And I've had people comment on that like being strange. And I'm like, well, I'm not the only person who does it, you know? People can find out my name if they want to. It's not that hard. You know, I don't feel like I'm really an anonymous account, but anyway, I'm comforted knowing that you're out there tweeting on the University Bookman handle.
Yes. I did it from the beginning and not really thinking about it since at the time we opened up the Twitter, I was basically the only person. And so it would be weird for me to be posting under 2 handles, but there's no one else really at the time at the U Bookman. But now we've sort of grown a little bit and have done some different things, but no one has objected to me keeping the handle.
So can you tell us a bit about this publication?
Sure. The University Bookman is the oldest book review from the right of center perspective. It was founded in 1960 by Russell Kirk and would come out quarterly inside the copy of National Review that you subscribe to.
Oh, interesting.
For years and years and years. And it was focused a lot and is still somewhat focused on educational textbooks. What are academics reading and issuing for their classes, and would assess them. And Russell would edit it himself. After a while, it spun off into its separate mailing and had its own separate mailing list and subscriber base. And Jeff Nelson, his son-in-law, became the editor, and I started contributing to the Bookman in the 90s. And Jeff had then handed it off to me 20 years ago or so, 15 years ago, where we moved from hard copy to online. And we did that because of for the obvious reasons at the time. It was very expensive and we wanted to reach more people. And so we've gotten thankfully, a very good audience and also a really quality body of reviewers. And we try and cover every subject. We're not specifically political, and although they draw a lot of the interests of the book are obviously derived from me, which is that Catholic intellectual history, American history. I'm a lawyer during the day, so a lot of legal books, but I try to make sure our canvas is very, very broad and covers a lot of topics with a lot of subjects. And we've, for example, published a lot of reviews of books that are not yet into English, that are published in Europe, because I want the audience to read those that may never get published in English. So it's a part of the work of the Russell Kirk Center in Michigan that was founded after Russell died, that is maintained in his own house and in his own library, which is this room multiplied by 150. And they put on a lot of seminars and have scholars stay there and do their work for weeks at a time. And the Bookman then puts out a lot of the work in terms of reviews that our reviewers put together.
Wow.
Great. Well, we'll definitely link to the University Bookman site in the description here. Gerald, you, if I'm not mistaken, you said something recently about wanting to see more of a Catholic film discourse going on, something like that. What was it you said?
Yeah, and I had last summer I had published in ISI a piece that said something like, "I love Tolkien and Lewis, and I love Catholic literature, but I've also come, and you guys might have come to this, although I am a very bookish person, our culture is not particularly bookish."
That's right.
And so while I would love to have Catholic intellectuals write the great books and go to college and graduate school and so on and make those decisions, but I would rather and also see a cadre of Catholic intellectuals who want to make video games, write films, write music, because that is where people are engaged. And if one were to look through Catholic history, I think what you find is all of that is being done. So
Yeah.
our cathedrals are beautiful in Europe and Asia and other places because those people are creators. They're not writing books about it. Other people might be, but both need to be done. And although it's very hard in the Western culture now because so much of awful creative work is being put in front of you and it's hard to choose or stick to the stuff that's good for you, I still think it's worth a shot because that's what people are looking at. And I did in the Bookman, we did a number of reviews of books on the video games. And I was astonished by how many people spend hours and hours and hours in that genre.
Right.
And what those games do to the history. You can enter into a ancient Greek game, which is sort of true, but maybe not true. And how do you? And are you calculating and generating virtue, or are you losing your mind in those games? And I think there needs to be more discussion of that. Maybe there is, and I'm too old and don't see it, but I haven't yet seen it because I've been trying for reviewers and essay writers to write about it.
Yeah, that's interesting because that was kind of part of the impetus behind our beginning this podcast was, kind of recognizing, hey, we live in a culture that is just dominated by film. Film and television is probably the predominant medium of our day. And if we want to talk about art, if we want to talk about, how to view things critically or how to elevate culture, then maybe like a good starting point is talking about film of a certain caliber, beyond sort of like what has become the big blockbuster type of movies nowadays. Right. And, it's actually also something we even struggled over in starting this podcast was kind of like, well, are we just contributing to this problem of just producing more and more content that people just sort of like, mindlessly consume?
Not in the film, not with regard to the films we discussed, but with regard to like the podcast itself, the podcast episodes. Because I'm, as someone who has listened to way too many podcasts, I'm very aware of like how much, and I'm also a musician, so I'm like, I don't want my podcast to be like, I don't want people to be listening to my podcast instead of listening to good music, for example.
Right. But, I guess ultimately we decided that this is where people are, and this is where that level of engagement can begin. Yeah. And so certainly the hope is that people will discover this podcast, and then in so doing also discover some of these great films that we're talking about. I can't tell you how many people, guests included, with whom we've spoken, who never heard of the Vatican Film List, for instance. Now, I had never heard of it myself before beginning this project. But it's interesting, there is this kind of wealth that is lying fallow in even in film. Right? But that's a good segue into this film that we're talking about today, because this film this was in 1986, I think.
Something like
that.
86 or 87, I forget.
Right. And this is, by all accounts, a blockbuster type film. It's got A-list actors.
Yeah.
It won an Academy Award, a score by Ennio Morricone. It's shot on location. It's a sweeping cinematic masterpiece. Really, it's as good a film as any that we've talked about on this podcast. But it's also very much a Hollywood film. And in that sense, it's kind of interesting. I don't know if it's actually a Hollywood film, but I'm using that sort of as a colloquialism. What I mean is that, it's interesting as a kind of watermark of how different the caliber of A-list movies we get nowadays versus just, a few decades ago. A lot of times people, especially Catholics, will point to this like golden age of filmmaking in the 40s and 50s or something. But this is 1986. This is Liam Neeson and Jeremy Irons and Robert De Niro, and this has got great Catholic, truthful themes, a truthful, if also scrutinizing look on a controversial historical period that, frankly, I don't believe could even be done nowadays. I sorry to cut you off. I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about that.
No, I think that's right, and I think that reflects something that, my earlier comment was only a starting jab, which is this movie to come out and to do so well and to be respected, I think reflects the fact that there was a larger culture interested in those topics. And now we're basically devolving into the fight between the tribe of Marvel and the tribe of DC. And that's what, and many people who observe or watch movies don't even know the culture that we've left. And so it's really, it's hard to, you can point to, and people more observant of movies, culture overall can list. There are obviously good movies from then until now, but they're sort of floating in this larger ocean. And the audience, which is the ocean, recognize the blockbuster culture more than it cares about the history behind books, behind movies like this. And so I think that's the challenge. And so that's why podcasts like yours make sense, because you've started to highlight the movies that you should start to look for. And that, I think, is what's needed to pluck those out. And then that might then help the culture turn completely, so that making these movies won't be embarrassing anymore or won't be not available anymore.
It's interesting. We've come back to the topic of epic several times in this podcast. I don't know whether this film is rightly called, an epic or not, but it certainly has that kind of like heroism of like human sentiment that you don't get in movies. I mean, at the very least, the whole long sequence where Rodrigo, played by Robert De Niro, is pulling a sack full of his arms and armor up this mountain and climbing up a sheer rock face with it on a rope behind him. That is epic. And we keep coming back to Lawrence of Arabia as a touchstone for this, which I haven't even seen, but James has. This was written by the same writer. So just to refresh people, we're talking about The Mission, directed by Roland Joffe, who also himself later made a film about Saint Jose Maria Escrivá called There Be Dragons.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Which I haven't seen.
I've seen it. Yeah.
So, but and I think previously he had a really well-received film called The Killing Fields, and which was also on a historical subject. But the writer for this film was Robert Bolt, who wrote a film we've discussed before, A Man for All Seasons, but also Dr. Zhivago and Lawrence of Arabia. And I believe Zhivago, that is also something of an epic.
It is,
not?
yeah.
Yeah. So that seems to be his wheelhouse cinematically,
right.
which is really, really interesting. And I don't know, I don't tend to watch a lot of the kind of like what we call Oscar bait films now. So it's possible that some of the historical films now could qualify as epics still, but I do think that the range of like sentiment and like human virtues portrayed has narrowed in films. I mean, the main epics we get are Star Wars, and if we're lucky, something like The Lord of the Rings,
Right.
and epic in Marvel really just means like how many like portals are in the sky that aliens are coming through or whatever, So it's just interesting that these films don't seem to be made. These sorts of films seem to be made as much anymore.
Yeah, and frankly, even with Lord of the Rings is not a young film anymore.
That's so true.
That's so true. And I don't think
it came out when I was a teenager, so I think of it that way. But
I don't think it could be made anymore. And I think that people are beginning to wisen up to this with all this talk of the forthcoming Amazon series. I think a lot of people are kind of in a collective despair about what this could be.
Well,
perhaps
there's a great.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. I mean, for the movies you've mentioned, I saw Lawrence of Arabia a long time ago. Is that even if they are not, some people have accused me saying, well, the movie shouldn't just be lessons, like going to school, like learning about Catholic history, right? That no one will go see that. Of course, that's not true if they're well done. But to your point, a lot of the blockbuster movies aren't even hitting development of virtue, acknowledgement of vice, and in some secular form or some philosophical form that isn't directly saying it joins to Catholic theology. It's just you go in there, you don't understand why are the good people. We published a piece on Game of Thrones, the series, and said that there's no redemption in this show, so it's awful because you watch evil act one after another, and that's what you're supposed to be attracted to, and there's no forgiveness or redemption. And so this is a terrible book series and a terrible series, because if you compare it to a series with those things, with redemption, even if it's not explicitly Christian, it's still a better movie because you're showing people how to be good in a character way, in a way that this series does not. I first saw this movie in 1989 as a freshman, and it was presented for those students who wanted to be American Studies majors. And I was dissuaded from being a major of that type because the teachers, as they were going through this movie, were basically condemning Christian evangelization and saying it was terrible to everybody. And I had just come from a Jesuit high school. I was in a Jesuit college, and I said, this doesn't seem to me to be the right theme that I want to take for the next 3 years. I ended up going to classics, which was much better, but I had always had a bad thought about this movie because that's as if it had a message of anti-Christianity. And my daughter is now in college, who is taking a class on the Christian tradition, and said that they should all watch this movie. And I was a little nervous, saying, "Oh no, the class is teaching the same thing as mine did 25 years ago. That this is an anti-Christian movie." And so she and I watched it together, and I was, as you guys probably know, just floored by this movie and how Christian it was. Mm-hmm. And I got a bigger lesson, and so I thought that was worth. If you guys were interested, worth talking about.
Great. Well, yeah, that's very well put. So I'll just say a few quick words about the film for those who haven't seen it. This film stars Jeremy Irons as a Jesuit missionary and Robert De Niro as a mercenary and slave trader, later turned Jesuit missionary. And so it basically follows Jeremy Irons' character as he engages with this tribe, this Indian tribe, the Guarani.
Located in, I think it was northeastern Argentina and eastern Paraguay is the real location of the events of the film.
Right.
Yeah.
This film begins with a title card that says that the historical events depicted in the film are true. I don't know the specific history, so I can't really speak to that. But yes, so the mission that Jeremy Irons' character founds here with the Guarani people finds itself in the middle of a territorial transition from the Spanish Empire to the Portuguese. And the reason that this is significant is because under the Spanish crown, the Indians are protected from slavery, whereas under the Portuguese crown, they are not. And so this brings the mission and the missionaries there to a head with the governing authorities, but also with a cardinal who is sent there to kind of adjudicate the issue. And we'll get into it later, probably in the podcast, but some interesting questions of obedience come up, and all of that heads to a climactic and dramatic finale.
And this is taking place in like the 1750s or so.
Yes.
So the Baroque era of music, as you see a little bit in the film. And you mentioned the scores by Ennio Morricone. This movie has a famous score. Some people think it's his best score, and he's one of the most beloved film composers of all time.
Right.
So that's saying something. I mean, I had heard the music before I ever saw this film.
Right. Yeah. Probably many viewers who haven't seen the film will have heard the main theme from this film. It's very recognizable.
So I have some historical, tidbits I'll bust out as we go on when it seems appropriate.
Very good. Very good.
Yeah.
The movie starts, as I remember, right? Starts with a symbol of martyrdom, right?
Yes.
There is a Jesuit priest being hurled off of a waterfall on a cross, because that Jesuit has gone up by himself to bring Christianity to the peoples there. And that's when I think Jeremy Irons, that becomes his inspiration. So he goes up, and that's when there is a musical interlude that you guys may want to speak about. But it's still moving. I mean, you talk to, and I think this is an example of why in the current and generations back to when it first came out is in some ways a way to show them martyrdom as opposed to, as beautiful as they are, crucifixes in churches when they're trying to process. So my daughter and I had a conversation about this. Do you understand what people, what Christians, what Jesuit priests will die for? And this is what someone will die for, to bring Christ around the world. And they did this out of their love of Christ. And so when people tell you that, or when there are arguments that are raised about Christian movement around the world, especially out of Europe, although that isn't the only story, because India and other places have had Christians for hundreds of years also.
Right.
But when you think about what priests do, or what they have done, you can look at this person, and then this connects you to Maximilian Kolbe, right? This connects you to lots of other people. And one thing I try to tell them is that, so this is something you're watching that has happened for hundreds of years. Isn't this message worth exploring than what just the public culture is telling you about Christianity? Because you can now see in vivid color what these people have done. And so when we could talk about sin of evangelization, or the sin of these other Europeans, but you have to look at the whole story going into this, that not all of these Europeans are being vicious.
Yeah, and I think that's one reason it's so insidious, that we're just bathed in this culture of critique and deconstruction, to where as you were describing even in your class in 1989, in the university system, this was even the missionaries themselves were being sort of looked askance at, not just the people that they were resisting, the forces of enslavement that they were trying to protect the Indians from, and to kind of see it all as just this one unit European culture without making any kind of differentiation, and seeing it all as essentially toxic. It prevents people from watching a film like this with an open mind, I think,
Right.
because they've already been prepared and primed to look at everything cynically.
Right. I mean, even if you look at sort of the when things come to a head in this film, it's because the cardinal who doesn't want to betray the powers that be. He very much wants to kind of go along to get along. We discovered that he has other political concerns back in Europe that he's sort of counterbalancing against the concerns here in South America. He asks the Guarani people to just go back into the woods, go back to their way of life, leave the mission. And they won't. They don't want to. The mission has become their home, and they don't want to go back to the way they were living before. Now, this is anathema, to contemporary, wisdom, and the accepted message, right? Is that everything that the settlers brought with them, up to and including religion, is all.
And the missions were essentially prisons.
Right. Right. So that's one of the reasons why the way this film chooses to begin is so striking. It opens first off with the cardinal. We're given to understand that this is after the fact. In fact, you hear kind of in the background slight sounds of explosions or something that he's kind of recalling, and he's dictating a letter to the Pope about the events that have just happened. But very quickly, we're shown this flashback of the first priest to get martyred there, up with the Guarani people above the falls. And it's a very striking way to begin the film, in part because, after that point, it doesn't seem to have played much of a role at all in the rest of the events of the film, right? Except for the fact that it's with this priest's death that Jeremy Irons' character arrives, replacing him, and he ultimately fares better with this tribe of people than his predecessor did. But still, it's not like it's mentioned again. It's not like this becomes a sticking point that has to be addressed with the tribal elders or anything like that.
Yeah, that's
interesting. It's kind of like a seed that's planted.
Yeah. The through line is the cross,
right? That's right.
That he takes from the place where he died, and then ultimately passes on to Rodrigo.
Right. But it very much recalls to mind the that famous line, "The blood of martyrs is the seed of the church." Yeah. And if that first martyrdom that we see at the beginning of the film, as that cross plunges into the water, is sort of viewed as the planting of a seed, well, then it's understood that courses through all of the events that follow afterward, if even only implicitly.
There's some interesting baptismal imagery with that.
Definitely.
Now that I think of it, martyrdom as being kind of baptism by blood.
That's right.
That's right.
Right. That's right.
One reason I find this, one thing I found so moving about this film, which, I only just saw for the first time this week, was that I had read some about the mission system, specifically in Paraguay. And I read a book by, I want to say like a late 19th century or early 20th century historian years ago. I'm sure you'd know him, but I forget his name. On this system, I forget what the Spanish word for these missions. It wasn't just a mission; they had like a specific term for this specific kind of setup they had in Paraguay. But those places have a really great legacy, but they were kind of destroyed at a certain point by the Jesuits getting kicked out of these countries and by the dissolution of the Jesuit order, which we should mention, one concern that the cardinal has and the Pope has in sending him here is that the status of the Jesuits in various parts of Europe is already being challenged, and that there's danger that the Jesuits could be kicked out and suppressed in various countries. And by that same token, the authority of the church itself. And so in order to try to save the Jesuit order and in some sense the church in Europe, they've decided to give up the Jesuits' position in the colonies. And it ultimately failed because I think it was the Reducciones, that's what those missions were called. So very shortly after the withdrawal of the Jesuits from South America, they were expelled from Portugal, and within 25 years, the order had been suppressed by the Vatican. Although, on the other hand, the disputed territories were actually very quickly returned to Spanish control from the Portuguese, and ultimately slavery was abolished through the whole region. So there's some interesting aftermath to this historically, but the fact that they didn't achieve what they wanted to in sort of selling out these natives, kind of just goes to show you that you just have to do what's right instead of making these kind of purely expedient, calculations.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. There's this very interesting, what I got out of the movie watching it again is that there's a lot of multiple relationships that I think are still applicable, right? There's the cardinal and the political powers. What does the church do in connection with the political matters? The cardinal himself knows he's doing something wrong when he moves the missions over to Portugal. He knows that they're going to die, and he has a complicated more political reason to save the Jesuit order. The Jesuits, at least the ones in where he is, have a relationship with him. They have to obey him, but they don't care if not that they don't care that the Jesuit order is suppressed, but they have an obligation to Christ right now with this community, and so are fighting with him. And so you're getting sort of two dynamics that still go on with the church in various countries. And where are they to be? How much are they to ally with with political power, or where else do they just assert themselves and might be persecuted themselves? And you see a little bit of that, and I think this might be an echo. So if the water is a symbol of baptism, you have the scene where De Niro kills his brother over a personal fight that they're having, and the Spanish and Portuguese are killing the native people. Are we not brothers? Right? What is it not the same? And so they are. De Niro then uses that to become a Jesuit, right? To turn to Christ, and you see when the Spanish and Portuguese soldiers hit the church, Jeremy Irons is coming out holding the monstrance with a bunch of women and children. And what I found astonishing is that the soldiers go down on their knees and take it to the cross. They recognize that God is right there, and they're about to kill innocent people. It's astonishing. And so my daughter and I had to have a question to say, a conversation saying, do you see what's happening? They're looking at God, and yet they are also sinning at the same time. And so, and some are, and Jeremy Irons is walking out to be killed on Christ's behalf. And so that's the human conflict that goes on all the time. And I found that just very striking, because he's fighting that way, and De Niro is fighting by going back to the gun. And they both die, perhaps virtuously. We can talk about that in both ways, but it's the ways that men resist. When you see one of the scenes of De Niro when he climbs up the mountain, right, after he's agreed to become a Jesuit, he has his armor he's holding behind him, and the Native American peoples cut it off for him so he can be free. What does that represent? It represents sin, right? That's what's going on. And your brother helps you be free. And it doesn't have to be the Spaniard next to you, right? It's anyone who believes. And so all those scenes are just astonishing because it combines the uh, it the temptation of sinfulness as well as also the mercy of God, even among
Right.
people that you've killed, right? Or that are going to be killed. It's just astonishing to me. And how they would do that today, it's unclear to me because you have to have both are worthwhile.
Yeah. Yeah. There's some really compelling moral complexity in this film. Even going right from the beginning where we get the opening line from the cardinal, he says something like, "Your Holiness, the Indian peoples now are free to be enslaved once more by the Spanish and Portuguese." And it sounds very sinister, and it sounds very like, oh yes, I know this character. This is the evil churchman, who has come to do His Holiness's bidding and to enslave the native peoples. But then, he says, "Oh, that sounds too harsh. Let me start it again." And later, as we get to know this character, I think we're given reason to think that opening line is him being a little bit tongue in cheek, him being a little bit bitter about what has transpired.
So.
And we begin to sympathize more with him, even if we still see the error in his judgment. The same with Robert De Niro's character, beginning very unsympathetically, and then almost immediately, like turn on a dime, we're sympathizing with him, and this complicated situation with his brother and this woman that they both love. And then even at the end, when the Portuguese are assaulting this mission, like you mentioned, Gerald, they've lined up, they're getting ready to fire their cannons, and they hear the songs being sung, the religious hymns, and we're even given a line from the soldiers saying, "None of us wants to do this." And we can see in the commander, the leading commander there, that he too is a little unsure, but he ultimately, suppresses his conscience and tells them, "I don't care," and then gives the order. So there is a real moral complexity. We see these atrocities being committed, but we also understand the humanity of it, our fallen nature, and we're not given these kind of caricatures of one-sided, super villains, except for maybe, the leading, like the local governor or whatever his name is, Cabeza, and the representative from Portugal, who very much, they represent the governing interests that want to enslave these Indians. So that's something that's very gratifying watching it, and again, something that I'm not sure that we're capable of that level of moral discourse in our storytelling nowadays.
Right, or at least it's only to like the way that like moral indecision or inner moral conflict in a character functions in today's story is simply to make us sympathize with the main character who's an anti-hero or something like that.
Right.
I wanted to go back to kind of the path that Father Rodrigo, again played by De Niro, takes. So he starts out as this slave trader. He murders his brother over a woman, and the first encounter we see between him and Father Gabriel is when he's hiding in the woods, attacking and trapping Indians. But the first real conversation we see between them is when Father Gabriel is asked to go and visit him. He's in prison, but he kind of his own accord, because apparently under the laws regarding dueling, he wouldn't actually be prosecuted. But he feels shame over what he's done. And this confrontation is really interesting because it goes a way you don't expect, where Father Gabriel mocks him. you know, he's like, "Are you laughing at me?" He's like, "I am laughing at you because what I see is laughable." You're running away from you're running away from this. He's like challenging. It's very like savvy of him to challenge him in his manhood, to provoke him to repentance, which is really interesting, instead of like feeling self-pity and despair. But then we get this line, which is very ominous and kind of hangs over the Father Rodrigo's journey in this film, which is, he's trying to get him to try penance. And he says, there's no penance hard enough for me. And he says, but do you dare to try? And Father Rodrigo says, do you dare to see it fail? Which is really interesting. And it's like, whoa. So like, we have to watch this character. We can't take anything for granted with this guy, so that kind of follows the film through. I don't think it does fail in the end,
right.
but it does inform our view of this guy and asking like, okay, is this guy converted? Is he going to see it through? And that's a really interesting and provocative way of starting that character's, series of changes that he goes through.
Right. I think that's right. And watching this movie the first time and hearing the teacher's comments, I had been lucky enough to read Christopher Dawson in 1987 and 88, and before this movie, where he makes the point that the Christian evangelizers aren't just seeking gold and slaves. They're separate, and they're seeking to provide the gospel message. You can't cut that off and say that's fake and covering for these two. And so that's the only way to understand European and Christian generally history. And I think this plays that very well and shows that very well. That yes, there are bad Spaniards and Portuguese there, but the Jesuits are allowed to sort of come along with them and have come along on their own. And so that comes up, I think, in the grand scene where the cardinal hears the indigenous people speak. And are they human or not? Which the Spanish and Portuguese have challenged, that they are slaveable because they're not human like people in Europe or Asia or other people they have met, because they don't have a grand civilization. They don't have, they do cannibalism or whatever it is that they throw at them. And the cardinal has to look. And it's my understanding, although I haven't looked at it in a while, is that is a rare discussion among slaveholding countries over history. To talk to people and say, well, if these are humans, they cannot be enslaved if they are able of. And so what do they use for that? They use music. The cardinal goes and looks at the cathedral built by these people and rules that obviously under any metaphysical theory or theology, they are people. And so I can't justify my slaveholding by just casting them away out of moderation. And I found it very moving because it's obviously true to us sitting here now, and obviously obvious to the Jesuits in 1750 who were there with them. But there has to be a European fight about this. And there's Bartolomeo de las Casas, who is Columbus's one of the Columbus era, and Sepulveda are all talking about this, trying to make that argument in Europe, and where people don't see them as so obvious human.
Yeah, and that had already been settled. That question had really been settled a few hundred years before in Europe, but it was still in question for the people who wanted to enslave, the Indians. That dispute had happened. Slavery had been outlawed, except under very specific circumstances. In the Spanish Empire, around the time of Columbus. But yeah, so these philosophical and legal issues are being worked out. But it's always interesting how in the colonies, the reach of the official legal policy is not so strong.
And that is, if I can jump in, and that is, I think, a nuance that is lost. Right. So it's not that the church is supporting oppression. It's that they have little authority or power to fix it in the New World. And they're fighting in Europe over the legal principles that why. And so in that hundreds of years, the papacy is trying to protect these people. But it's not like today, like I can get on a Zoom call and yell at the Spaniards. Right? This is not something that's easy. Right. And so the church has spent hundreds of years to expand the the demolition of slavery, but it does. But because we are prone to temptation and people are prone to get rich and use vicious means, it keeps popping up, and it doesn't seem to be able to stop.
So music functions in a very integral way in this film. The soundtrack is integrated with the storyline in an interesting way. And so the first time you see Father Gabriel going up above the falls to find the Guarani, he stops in a kind of a grove where he thinks they might be nearby and pulls out an oboe and assembles it and starts playing this beautiful melody, which becomes the main theme of the film. And just, aside from, just as a side note, I really like the way this functions, because the fact that you see him playing it connects that theme to him even more than it otherwise would be connected to him as that character's theme.
Right.
And the way that it comes back in the background in the midst of other themes in the film is really beautiful and moving. It's very effective, and it's so purely lyrical that that it kind of like retains its purity. It's not like sort of transformed into like, oh, this is like the ominous version of this theme, or like it maintains his like fundamental attitude throughout the film. And but it's interesting that like his like, this is like a real gesture of faith in the Indians' humanity that he does this. I mean, he's just seen, the last thing they did was they killed the last guy who came up there, and he sits down and starts playing the oboe, and it is such a like an act of confidence in like his ability to communicate with these people through beauty. And so this also takes kind of like the reverse form in the film, where their ability to make music is used again and again as kind of proof of their humanity. When they have that meeting you referenced, the boy is singing, and he's singing Western music, and you can say, oh, this is like racist in itself to like say that like to prove their humanity, they have to like adopt Western norms. But like, sure, okay, maybe you could like prove it by playing like having them play their own music or something, but it's just it's clearly like this is a tricky situation. It's the most efficient way to show everybody they can do what we do, so then we get this whole middle section of the film where the cardinal visits all the different missions, and over again they're seen singing sacred music, and they're in these churches that they've built, and he's kind of blown away by it. I find the cardinal to be like that whole section. I don't find him to be a very interesting character, but still that section of the film is moving just because it shows you we've spent all our time in this one least developed mission in the film, and it shows you what they've already accomplished and the full like grandeur of it. We see that there is a native priest there, which is really cool.
Right.
In the oldest of the missions. So we see that they've already, acquired some level of not only have the Jesuits not just totally replaced the pre-existing governing structure of the tribe because the king is still the king, but they also now are starting to have a native clergy, which is, very, very important, just to see, the way that if you wanted to defend this film against sort of like an anti, Western critic, you could point to that. Right. But then the music, of course, takes on its most poignant, form in the scene where the martyrdom is occurring, and the Indians who stay behind with Father Gabriel are doing Eucharistic adoration and benediction, and they are singing sacred music as they go forth and die. So the way that the score is integrated is really beautiful, and I think that it is a big part of what makes this movie a classic. I'm sure.
Yeah, well, it's one of the strengths of this film, I think, is that it leverages symbol so well throughout the film. not just aural in terms of the recurrent themes that we're hearing and the way music is used, because music almost always represents something more than music every time it's invoked. But also visually, whether it's like a symbol that was already mentioned with Rodrigo's chosen penance carrying up all of his arms and armor, up this mountainside, but also the setting, always returning to this waterfall and these cliffs, right? So all of this sort of expresses, it has an expressive potency that goes beyond just what we're being shown. And I think that it's something that's remarkable about the film as a film, right? Is that, and it's interesting actually that this is written by Robert Bolt, because we talked about this writer before when we did A Man for All Seasons. And in that case, right, A Man for All Seasons was a play before it was adapted into a film. Mm-hmm. And on that episode, which is one of our early episodes, we talked with our guest then, Nathan Douglas, about adaptation and about how the film A Man for All Seasons is not particularly successful as an adaptation in leveraging the things that are unique about film. But I feel like it's the complete opposite with The Mission, where you look at the first 30 minutes of this film, for instance, and the economy of exposition, the way that these characters and this story are introduced, primarily visually, then also through music, and then through words. I mean, there are very few words that are spoken in the first 30 minutes of this film. Instead, we're being shown the drama, we're being shown the problems, and it's being represented to us visually, not just through these kind of dramatic encounters like that initial meeting with the Guarani, where Father Gabriel is playing the oboe, all pretty much done in silence, right? And because they don't speak each other's languages, right? So, but also, symbolically, and seeing this little man scaling this massive cliff in this huge waterfall, right? Yeah. And we're given this line by one of his confreres asking another, "Do you see him?" And he turns, he says, "No." Right. And there's something evocative about that, right? So I kind of want to give credit where credit is due, because we were, I think, a little hard on Robert Bolt all those episodes ago. An excellent writer, and the play A Man for All Seasons is an excellent play. Here, a lot of that, a lot of his wit and dexterity with the pen is very restrained, and instead turned, I would think, to the writing for the screen. He writes situations, and there's a real economy in how these characters are introduced and how their interior drama as well as the exterior drama is unfolded. Mm-hmm.
Just to give one example of that, I mean, when you see Father Gabriel scaling that cliff, it's a great indication that, this is a man. This is a courageous man. We're going to see him as something of a pacifist. So it's important that he's established as a man of even physical courage, and it's unimaginable to me climbing that wet cliff face without any kind of equipment or anything. Yeah. It's insane. And then also when he goes and challenges Rodrigo, we see that same courage in another form. Mm-hmm. We see that this is a man who can go toe to toe with another man, right? In his own way, despite the fact that he might not be as physically strong. He might not be a warrior, but this is not a man, who needs to feel comfortable.
Right.
That's it's funny you say that. That's actually what I told my daughter, which is, you do know that, we've had this discussion, that the Jesuits were started by a soldier. Right. The people in the mold of Ignatius are the men that can survive on their own in a very sort of soldierly manner, but not one that is violent in the way that Ignatius was as a young man, but strong enough to push the message of gospel. And that's why you have to show them this way. This is who they were. They weren't just sitting around doing nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to say one thing bouncing off of that and kind of going back to your remark about this encounter between Rodrigo and Father Gabriel in that cell. Just how different that is from what is regarded as like the accepted wisdom today about how to speak to sinners, right?
Or how priests in movies talk.
Right. And it's always, my son and compassion and pity and warmth. And, here there's a challenge, the gauntlet is thrown down. Yeah. It's an appeal to you need to be punished. There needs to be retribution. Like penance needs to be undertaken.
Yeah.
And you're a coward to turn from that. And this is actually what's capable of reaching Rodrigo.
Yeah.
I think
he knows what kind of man he is.
Right.
He's really got his man.
Right. And I think that that's something that is not considered often enough in like today's therapeutic culture, right? That unfortunately is present even in the church, perhaps especially in the church. Is that justice? We crave justice even as regards ourselves, right. And he's determined. Rodrigo's character, he's determined to see this penance through, and we see how arduous this is. It's shown to us, and we see the other Jesuit brothers in the midst of this. Liam Neeson's character and one or two others saying, this is crazy. He's done enough. In fact, at one point, Liam Neeson's character comes and hacks the bundle of armor and weapons off of him, cuts the rope, it tumbles back down the cliffside, and Robert De Niro's character goes back down, reties it, and keeps going, right? So it's again, like there's this eloquence, because that scene happens without any words being spoken, right? We're being shown this. And how often do we see priests basically doing that, hacking the penance off of people's backs, right? It's almost like the reverse of Jesus's rebuke to the Pharisees about you load people up with heavy burdens, right? It's like we remove people's righteous burdens, and it's left to us to go back and pick them up.
That's really interesting.
And Father Gabriel, in his wisdom, tells Liam Neeson's character, he says, it may be that this penance has been enough, but it hasn't been enough for him, and so it's not enough for me. And as long as it's not enough for him, he will keep going. He says only God knows. And of course, finally, it's one of the native people who comes over, and we're not sure, and it's a kind of tense moment. We're not sure if he's going to slit Robert De Niro's throat or what, but what he does instead is cuts the weapons from his back.
Yeah.
And it's a very moving. I mean, I almost cried at this part, and I seldom cry during movies, but we see this dirtied and exhausted Robert De Niro, just break down sobbing and then laughing from
That's right.
the power of this release, and I think that this also speaks to something that I find remarkable about this film, and particularly about the performances in this film, is that even in like a dead medium like film, we are still able to be reached by physical feats and physical exhaustion. I think that part of what makes that scene work is the sense of how spent this character is, and the feats that we've seen accomplished up until that point. When we see, whether it's seeing Rodrigo scaling the cliffside with this heavy burden on his back, or it's seeing Father Gabriel at the beginning climbing through water and slipping and hitting his head, there's still like a power that carries, that I call it a dead form, because this is, at the end of the day, it's pixels on a screen that we're watching, right. but there's a there's an eloquence to physical feats that that seems to still have its kind of power and expressive potential even in film.
So yeah, let's talk about the kind of the conflict between Father Rodrigo and Father Gabriel, and the different ways that they choose to respond to this crisis of the Guarani being told to leave, and the kind of incursion of the Spanish and Portuguese upon the mission.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that you can't talk about it without mentioning this broader theme of obedience, because it's something that's invoked throughout the film. At the time of Rodrigo's kind of being brought into the order, Father Gabriel asks him, "Can you obey my orders as if they were coming from a commander-in-chief?" And Rodrigo says yes. And we see this dynamic play out later when the cardinal demands that Rodrigo apologize to the governing authorities. This is a matter of obedience, not just for Rodrigo, but also for Father Gabriel, for that matter.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I think the cardinal himself says to these governing authorities at another point that Jesuits are known for their obedience. That is kind of like their charism. They do take a special vow of obedience to the Pope, right?
Right.
And so obedience is a question, and we see that drama play out in that initial court proceeding, where we know what the truth is, and we know that Rodrigo doesn't really have anything to apologize for, but he's in holy obedience offering this apology. Well, later, when it's clear that the church represented by this cardinal is going to ask that this mission be shut down and handed over to the Portuguese, well, all of a sudden we get these two priests, Father Gabriel and Father Rodrigo, not really obeying what they've been asked to do. And they disobey in two different ways. Father Gabriel stays behind with the people. He tells the cardinal that he will do this, and he leads them in prayer. He refuses to take up arms. Rodrigo, moved by the injustice of all of this, and then kind of the miraculous reemergence of his sword fished out of the river by one of the native boys, decides to take up the sword again and organize this
along with basically all the other Jesuits,
right? Organize this violent resistance. This is kind of, for me, this is a stumbling block, because of course I'm a big believer in obedience. What I mean is, it's a human institution and a divine one, and so there's going to be instances where obedience is not going. You can never be asked to sin, right? I mean, that's pretty much it. It's like anything before sin, you're bound to obedience.
Well, I mean, I think you can pretty clearly say it's a sin to tell these people to leave the mission.
Yeah.
And it's certainly a sin to just give them up to be murdered.
Right.
So I don't have a problem with what Father Gabriel does. And it would be, I think it's pretty clearly it would be a sin to just abandon them. Father Rodrigo at one point asks to be released from his vow, and then is kicked out by, not of the order, but just Father Gabriel just won't listen to it. And I don't know if we ever see him be formally released from his vow or not. I don't know if that's implicit, just as the way that it never showed him being ordained. Do you think that's implicit? Do you think he was? Is there any way to get a sense of whether he was actually formally released from his vow?
The sense that I got is, doesn't Father Gabriel transfer the cross to Rodrigo?
He does.
And that's how I took it. That
he refuses to bless him, because he says that if he's right, then he doesn't need his blessing, and if he's wrong, then his blessing won't do any good for him. But he does give him the cross, which formerly belonged to the priest who was martyred.
So that's how I took it. Not any verbal openness, but that De Niro was continuing the Jesuit tradition with these people. I can't relieve you of my your obligation for the reasons you presented, but I'm not going to stop you. And I'm giving this to you as a representation that you are representing the order.
Right.
And
so
I think
you can say that maybe he wasn't released from his vow, but that he was perhaps released from the outright command not to fight.
right.
But he
but he does tell him. He
either.
says that if you take up arms or shed blood or whatever, you will betray everything that we've done here.
That's true, but that is an earlier scene, and then in the later scene we see a more subdued Gabriel giving him the cross. So it's possible that he is being a little less forbidding about it. He clearly isn't ready to endorse it. I wanted to talk about that scene, that first exchange they have, that first argument they have. I wish I had written down the lines, but Father Gabriel, he basically, what does he say? Something about a world without love. Can you remember the exact line?
Yeah, he says, like, if might is right, then there
is no place for love in this world,
right.
And I'm not strong enough to live in a world like that, which I didn't really like that line.
No.
I feel like it kind of muddies the waters. It's like, what is this guy motivated by? Is he just like, is it wishful thinking? Like,
is it weakness?
Actually having doubts?
Yeah, right.
So I didn't like that. It didn't. Do you agree with that, Gerald?
Yeah, no, it's a weird way to put it, because Christ's love is in the world, and so might is not right. So if you're gonna go in that route, that's how I would think he would go, and say that it might be difficult to follow Christ's love, but it's not like might is right and controls. That's what you see in the world. That's not what you see from Christ's eyes.
Right.
And so I don't like the way that the sentence was worded.
There's a little bit of a deficiency in A Man for All Seasons in the characterization of St. Thomas More as being this sort of modern man of conscience, right? And there isn't enough of an appeal, if I remember correctly, to the supernatural. I think that there's a similar thing going on here in looking at Father Gabriel, from Robert Bolt's perspective, as the modern man of nonviolence.
Right.
But then lacking something of the supernatural and the recognition of Christ's love in the world as being the ultimate motive for nonviolence. That's like oversimplified, because obviously there are instances where violence is justified.
And I don't want to see his choice to go out with the Eucharist at the end as some kind of like existentialist choice to like decide what reality he wants to live in.
Right. Right. Exactly. But I am grateful that there is the benediction, right? And actually he gives the benediction in the Indian language, which is interesting. And so there is this acknowledgement of prayer and of the Blessed Sacrament, right? That's something.
So Rodrigo goes, he fights, he kills. It's sad. It's sad to see him going back to that. He might not be breaking his vows. He might be at peace with Father Gabriel in some way, but he is sort of returning to his old way, but not completely. It's not completely. It could be like the Unforgiven or something, where it's like there's the seeming to return to his old way, but something fundamentally, has changed.
I feel like even in his performance, you can see that there's still a conflict. There's an inner conflict.
Yeah.
It's not unambiguous.
And then what we see is they've set up this explosive gunpowder trap under the bridge, and he's going to pull the string to trigger the explosion. And then he sees that a native boy is in need of help, and he runs over to help him. And then he comes back and they've cut the string. And so we see what he chooses. Finally, we see what is really in his heart,
right.
Which is less care for violence and being in control of the situation, and more care for the native people, however, he may be expressing it. And so, and then his last moments, we see Father Gabriel's act through his eyes as he's
Yes.
dying.
Yeah,
Yep.
and I think that that's a very important moment because he's given this opportunity to look around to see the futility of this gesture of resistance, if you want to put it that way, that that they lost, that they're not going to save this mission. But he's also able to see, I think, something more than that in Father Gabriel with the Eucharist. I think that if there was any sin, we can hope that in that moment he does repent of whatever sin there may have been. And I think that it's a very different ending than if he was just shot and killed, right? That we are given this suggestion that he has a kind of an interior movement in those final moments of his life.
And it's beautiful too that we see this Guarani man pick up the monstrance when Father Gabriel is shot.
Yes.
And keep carrying it on.
Yeah.
So the other line I didn't like in the movie was the line you mentioned at the end, the voiceover, where he says, like, they are dead, but I feel like your priests are all dead, but I feel like I'm the one who's dead and they're the ones who are alive, because like something about human people. What's the line? Oh, the spirit of the dead will survive in the memory of the living. And I'm like, what? Come on, man. Like, that's so weak. That like is so inadequate to everything that we've seen. But it's interesting though, because a friend of mine was telling me, she showed me like a YouTube clip of the ending of the film from like the DVD version. I watched this on the Criterion channel, and at the end of the version she showed me, there was text on the screen at the end of the film that wasn't in the Criterion channel
I feel like I remember that from the first time
and it
that I
says
saw
something
this.
like, even today the native peoples are fighting for their survival and blah 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 blah. So like it connects with that line, and it's a more of like a here's your like activist takeaway from this movie. So I'm kind of glad that I don't think we need to have that text on the screen to like get that part of it, you know, but to have it on the screen kind of detracts from like the broader point of the film, I think. So
it's funny that you bring that up, because the first time I saw this film was years ago, when I was still in the seminary, actually. And I remember watching it with some other seminarians. And I think like that was what left a bad taste in my mouth, was this sort of like activist-y feeling text appended at the end there.
Yeah. So you mentioned one of you mentioned that the conflict in the soldiers going when they hear the chanting and the Eucharist and everything. I actually don't believe that they would have shot a priest carrying the Eucharist. I don't believe it. I think that it works on a spiritual level in the film. That's what they're doing. That's what they're doing when they enslave and kill the natives. That I think all that works. But I actually don't believe. I believe that like that taboo, that cultural instinct, would be too strong. I simply don't believe. I can believe they might shoot a priest who was fighting back at them, but I really don't believe that they would have shot a priest, especially because there was no reason for them to do so, carrying the monstrance. Do you guys agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Probably
you agree, or
probably.
Yeah. So that brings me to a historical point. The actual Father Gabriel is based on an actual saint, Saint Roque Gonzalez de Santa Cruz. He was martyred not by Europeans, but by order of a Guarani chieftain. So, along with two other Jesuits. So that's interesting. So I still don't feel like this film is like a revisionist film in that sense, that it shows like the other Catholic Europeans killing them instead of what actually happened, which is that the natives killed them, which is interesting. You could look at that in a revisionist kind of like anti-Western light, but I think it works on a poetic level, and I am kind of curious. Have you guys heard are there any Catholic saints who have been martyred specifically by like missionaries who are martyred specifically by like European Catholics? There have been missionaries who were martyred by Protestants, like in the La Florida missions in the United States, or in America, killed by English Protestants, priests, Spanish and natives slaughtered. But I don't know if there's any actual instances historically of Catholic missionaries being killed despite all the conflicts they had with the colonials.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. I can't think of anything.
I don't know. So just bringing up that historical fact, do you guys have any thoughts on the fact that the film portrays something sort of different from what actually happened in that respect?
Well, I think that I don't know the answer to other Catholic priests, but I think that the scene probably still provides the historical message, which is that even if we can't find an example of Spanish or Portuguese killing priests, you see how they actually, or when their temptation comes, they reject what is in the monstrance and they kill people, right? So that's I took that as the message of that scene, not as to whether that was a true event. Yeah. But I think that
the missionaries did suffer on behalf of the natives,
right?
And they did suffer opposition. Right. So I think it is spiritually and poetically correct.
I think that's right, and I think that then the other half to your point is that dovetails with the priest going over the waterfall. So he's established the fact that the priests are martyrs from the people that they are trying to evangelize. So the fact that Gabriel isn't exactly the right end of story for him, I don't think makes the movie say that the priests are never martyred by the people they're trying to evangelize, but they're doing something a little bit different with that scene.
Yeah, it's not like a noble savage type concept.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us to talk about this movie.
Yeah,
and also
thank you both. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, I'll say thank you personally, because this kind of resuscitated the film a bit for me. Like I said, the first time I watched it, I had kind of left with a little bit of a bad taste in my mouth, and also assuming that the ending was more problematic than it is in terms of their act of disobedience. Talking to you guys and now reflecting on it, it's pretty obvious that they're able to be exculpated.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Well, next time we will be tackling the topic of the Saint film, and the film we'll be using to kind of start our Saint films, because there are a bunch of them on the Vatican list, will be Therese.
Great.
So anybody who has been watching this on YouTube, please subscribe. If you'd like to help us out with a donation and support all of our work at Catholic Culture, you can go to catholicculture.org/donate/audio. And we will also link to where you can watch Therese in the show notes if you want to get a head start on that and watch it before you see our discussion next time. But until next time, thanks for listening.